Picture this. A neuroscientist walks into a 300-year-old philosophical debate and announces he solved it. Not only that, he's going to completely revolutionize how we think about right and wrong. He's going to make morality scientific, objective, measurable. No more endless debates about ethics, just cold, hard facts about human well-being. This isn't the setup to a joke. This is literally what Sam Harris did with The Moral Landscape, and the results are so catastrophically entertaining that it deserves its own category in the annals of intellectual disaster. Harris didn't just write a bad philosophy book. He created a work so fundamentally confused, so breathtakingly arrogant, and so spectacularly wrong that it serves as a perfect case study in how smart people can convince themselves they've solved problems they don't even understand. We're about to witness the intellectual equivalent of someone confidently explaining rocket science while their own rocket explodes on the launch pad. Within the first 14 pages, Harris manages to contradict himself so completely that his entire project collapses before it even begins. It's like watching someone build a house and then immediately drive a bulldozer through the foundation. Here's what happens. Harris makes two claims that cannot possibly both be true. First, he declares that the well-being of conscious creatures is the only thing we can reasonably value. Then, literally in the same breath, he admits that scientific knowledge presupposes values like logical consistency and evidence. Wait. Hold on. Let me get this straight. Harris is saying that logical consistency and evidence are values we need for science, but the only thing we can reasonably value is well-being. So either logical consistency is somehow about well-being, which is insane, or Harris has just admitted that science itself is unreasonable by his own definition. This isn't a minor inconsistency. This is like saying, only red things are colored, and then immediately pointing to a blue car. The logical contradiction is so blaring, so obvious, that it's genuinely mystifying how Harris, his editors, his publishers, and apparently thousands of readers missed it. But here's where it gets really beautiful. Harris actually offers us 3 ways to resolve this contradiction, and each one destroys his entire argument. Option 1. Logical consistency is really about well-being. This would mean that whether 2 + 2 is equal to 4 depends on whether it makes people happy. Harris would have to argue that mathematical truths are contingent on human psychology. Every mathematician in the world would laugh him out of the room. Option 2. We value logical consistency because it leads to well-being. This admission would mean that scientists and mathematicians don't actually value truth for its own sake, they only care about it instrumentally. Try telling a theoretical physicist that they don't really care about understanding the universe, they just want to maximize human happiness. See how that goes. Option 3. Well-being includes everything we might value. If well-being includes duty, justice, logical consistency, aesthetic beauty, and everything else we might care about, then the term becomes meaningless. Harris would have solved the problem of moral disagreement by defining it out of existence, like declaring that all animals are really just different types of dogs. Harris has checkmated himself in 3 moves, and the game hasn't even started. Harris mentions brains 27 times in the introduction alone. Not metaphorically, I counted. This isn't scientific rigor, it's what clinical neuroscientist Raymond Tallis calls neuromania, the delusion that everything meaningful about human experience can be reduced to neural activity. Harris's logic is essentially this: morality involves brains, therefore morality equals neuroscience. By this reasoning, since basketball involves brains, we should study basketball by examining neurons instead of, actually watching the game. Since poetry involves brains, literary criticism should be replaced by brain scans. Since falling in love involves brains, romance is really just a subspecies of neurology. This reductionist madness leads Harris to make claims that would be hilarious if they weren't so confidently asserted. He argues that because believing cruelty is wrong might activate similar brain regions to believing the sun is a star, there's no meaningful distinction between moral and factual claims. This is like arguing that because I use my eyes to see both hamburgers and the Grand Canyon, I should be able to eat mountains and go whitewater rafting through beef products. The logical fallacy is so transparent that it's embarrassing. But Harris doubles down on this confusion throughout the book. He seems to think that finding the neural correlates of moral judgment somehow proves that moral judgments are just disguised factual claims. This is like saying that finding the neural correlates of mathematical reasoning proves that mathematics is just disguised neuroscience. The deeper problem here is that Harris has confused the study of moral psychology with moral philosophy itself. Yes, we can study how people make moral judgments. Yes, we can identify brain regions involved in moral reasoning. But this tells us nothing about whether those judgments are correct or what we should value. It's the difference between studying how people do mathematics and determining whether their mathematical answers are right. When Harris needs to defend his central claim that morality must be about well-being, does he engage with the sophisticated philosophical alternatives that have been developed over centuries? Does he grapple with Kantian deontology, Aristotelian virtue ethics, or contractualist approaches to justice? Absolutely not. Instead, Harris constructs an army of straw men led by serial killers and religious fanatics. Harris literally writes, "What if Jeffrey Dahmer says the only peaks on the moral landscape that interest me are ones where I get to murder young men and have sex with their corpses?" He follows this with, "Someone else will be free to say that morality depends upon worshipping the gods of the Aztecs, and that well-being entails always having a terrified person locked in one's basement waiting to be sacrificed." This is not philosophical argument, it's intellectual theater. Harris has created a false dichotomy where you either agree with his utilitarian approach or you're a cannibalistic serial killer who worships ancient gods. It's like arguing that democracy is the best political system because the alternative is being Hitler. But here's what's really insidious about this strategy. Harris is avoiding the actual philosophical debate entirely. Real moral philosophers don't spend their time arguing about whether we should be Jeffrey Dahmer. They debate genuinely difficult questions. When individual rights conflict with collective welfare, which should take priority? How do we balance competing claims of justice? What are our obligations to future generations? How do we weigh different types of values, autonomy, equality, liberty, security? These are the questions that serious moral philosophy addresses, and Harris's vague appeals to well-being provide exactly zero guidance on any of them. His theory isn't just wrong, it's irrelevant to the actual debates that matter. Here's where Harris's intellectual arrogance reaches truly spectacular heights. When confronted with Immanuel Kant, arguably the most influential moral philosopher who ever lived, Harris dedicates exactly one paragraph and a few footnotes to dismissing him. This is extraordinary. Kant's moral philosophy represents a direct, systematic refutation of everything Harris wants to argue. Kant argued that 1. Morality cannot be empirical because it must be universal, and empirical facts vary across contexts. 2. Morality is about the intrinsic rightness or wrongness of acts, not their consequences. 3. Moral worth comes from acting from duty, not from maximizing well-being. 4. Practical reason, not empirical science, is the source of moral knowledge. These aren't minor disagreements with Harris's approach, they're fundamental philosophical contradictions. If Kant is right about any of these points, Harris's entire project collapses. So how does Harris respond to this challenge? He calls Kant's categorical imperative difficult to map onto the world with precision. The audacity is breathtaking. Harris, whose definition of well-being is so vague it could include literally anything, criticizes Kant for being imprecise. This is like a drunk person criticizing a surgeon for having shaky hands. But it gets worse. In the footnotes, Harris claims that Kant's ethics is really just covert consequentialism, that despite Kant's explicit arguments to the contrary, he was secretly agreeing with Harris all along. This is philosophical gaslighting of the highest order. It's like claiming that despite Einstein's explicit statements about relativity, he was really just doing Newtonian physics in disguise. The dismissal of Kant reveals something crucial about Harris's method. When confronted with sophisticated philosophical positions that challenge his view, he doesn't engage with them seriously. He either ignores them, misrepresents them, or waves them away with unsupported assertions. This brings us to the heart of Harris's conceptual confusion, his use of the term well-being. Throughout the book, Harris treats this concept as if it's obvious and uncontroversial. But when pressed for a definition, he retreats into vagueness and circularity. Harris calls well-being an evolving term and claims it includes everything from duty to fairness to justice. But this creates a massive problem. If well-being includes duty, fairness, and justice, then Harris hasn't provided a new theory of morality. He's just relabeled existing moral concepts with a feel-good scientific-sounding term. This is like claiming you've discovered a new branch of mathematics called numberology that includes everything from addition to geometry to calculus. You haven't made a scientific breakthrough, you've just created a useless umbrella term. The vagueness is strategic. When critics point out that people value things other than well-being, like justice, dignity, autonomy, or truth, Harris can simply expand his definition to include those values. When someone argues that certain moral duties might require sacrificing well-being, Harris can claim that fulfilling duties is actually a form of well-being. This makes Harris's theory unfalsifiable, which is the opposite of scientific. A genuinely scientific theory makes specific predictions that can be tested. Harris's theory can accommodate any possible moral intuition by stretching the definition of well-being to include whatever people happen to value. But the definitional problems go deeper. Harris seems to conflate several distinct concepts under the umbrella of well-being, hedonic pleasure, preference satisfaction, objective flourishing, and subjective life satisfaction. These are not the same thing, and they often conflict with each other. Consider a simple example. Someone might prefer to live a life of comfortable mediocrity rather than pursue challenging goals that would lead to greater objective flourishing. Which choice maximizes well-being? Harris's theory provides no guidance because he's never clarified what he means by the term. Harris explicitly acknowledges that his approach depends on consequentialism, the idea that the morality of an action depends entirely on its consequences. This is a specific philosophical position with a long history and sophisticated critics. But rather than defending consequentialism against its critics, Harris simply asserts that it's intuitive and moves on. This is philosophically disastrous. Consequentialism faces serious objections that Harris completely ignores. The most famous is the problem of moral demandingness. If maximizing well-being is the only moral consideration, then we might be morally required to sacrifice ourselves completely for others. If you could save 2 lives by giving up your own, consequentialism seems to demand that sacrifice. Most people find this counterintuitive. We think we have special obligations to ourselves and our loved ones that go beyond maximizing overall well-being. But Harris never addresses this problem. He simply assumes that consequentialism is correct and that anyone who disagrees is being unreasonable. Similarly, consequentialism faces the problem of moral luck. If morality depends entirely on consequences, then moral evaluation depends on factors beyond our control. 2 equally reckless drivers might face different moral judgments if one happens to hit a child while the other doesn't. This seems to violate our intuitions about moral responsibility. Harris also ignores the problem of moral epistemology. Even if consequentialism is correct, how can we possibly calculate the long-term consequences of our actions? The butterfly effect suggests that small actions can have enormous unpredictable consequences. This makes consequentialist decision-making practically impossible in complex situations. These aren't obscure philosophical puzzles, they're central problems that any serious consequentialist theory must address. Harris's failure to even acknowledge them reveals how superficial his engagement with moral philosophy really is. Perhaps most surprisingly for someone claiming to establish a new science, Harris repeatedly appeals to moral intuitions to support his arguments. When critics challenge consequentialism and moral realism, Harris responds that these positions correspond to many of our intuitions about how the world works. This is philosophically bizarre. Science is not in the business of confirming our intuitions, it's in the business of discovering truths that often contradict our intuitions. Our intuitions tell us that the Earth is stationary and the sun moves around it. Our intuitions tell us that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. Our intuitions tell us that time passes at the same rate for everyone. All of these intuitions are wrong, and science has demonstrated their falsity through careful empirical investigation. If Harris wants to establish a science of morality, he should be prepared to challenge moral intuitions, not defer to them. But Harris seems to want it both ways. When moral intuitions support his position, he treats them as evidence. When they contradict his position, he dismisses them as products of religious conditioning or evolutionary bias. This is not scientific methodology, it's confirmation bias dressed up in scientific language. The deeper problem is that Harris never explains why moral intuitions should be trusted at all. If our moral judgments are products of evolution, cultural conditioning, and psychological biases, why should we expect them to track objective moral truths? Harris needs to provide an account of moral epistemology, how we can gain knowledge of moral facts, but he never does. Harris's approach faces a practical problem that he barely acknowledges: who gets to determine what counts as well-being? If morality is a science, then presumably moral experts, people with scientific training in relevant fields, should have more authority than ordinary people in making moral judgments. Harris seems to embrace this implication. He suggests that some people's moral opinions are simply wrong because they're based on false beliefs about what promotes well-being. But this creates a deeply troubling elitist implication: moral knowledge becomes the province of experts rather than democratic deliberation. Consider the practical implications. If neuroscientists and psychologists understand well-being better than ordinary people, should they have more political power? Should moral decisions be made by scientific committees rather than through democratic processes? Harris never addresses these questions, but they follow naturally from his approach. The problem is compounded by disagreements among experts. Psychologists disagree about what constitutes well-being. Neuroscientists disagree about how to interpret brain imaging data. Economists disagree about what policies promote human flourishing. If moral truth depends on scientific expertise, how do we resolve disagreements among the experts? Harris's response seems to be that these disagreements will be resolved through further scientific research. But this assumes that questions about well-being have objective answers that science can discover. This assumption is itself a philosophical claim that needs justification. Harris repeatedly criticizes moral relativism, arguing that his scientific approach reveals universal moral truths. But his own approach faces a serious relativism problem that he never acknowledges. Different cultures have different conceptions of well-being and human flourishing. Western individualistic cultures emphasize personal autonomy and self-realization. Eastern collectivistic cultures emphasize social harmony and fulfilling one's role in the community. Some cultures prioritize material prosperity, others spiritual development. Harris assumes that science can determine which conception is correct, but this assumption is problematic. The scientific method itself emerged from a particular cultural context, Western European Enlightenment thinking. The values that guide scientific inquiry, objectivity, empirical testing, logical consistency, are not universal human values but specific cultural commitments. This creates a paradox. Harris wants to use science to establish universal moral truths, but science itself embodies particular cultural values. He's trying to transcend cultural relativism by appealing to a method that is itself culturally relative. The problem becomes concrete when Harris discusses specific moral issues. His analysis of women's rights in Islamic societies, for example, assumes that Western liberal values, individual autonomy, gender equality, are objectively correct. But from within traditional Islamic moral frameworks, these values might be seen as promoting selfishness and social disorder. Harris would argue that science can determine which framework is correct by measuring which produces greater well-being. But this assumes that well-being can be measured in culturally neutral ways, which is highly questionable. Harris's scientific approach requires that well-being be measurable in objective ways. But this creates enormous practical and theoretical problems that he barely addresses. How do we measure well-being across different individuals? People have different preferences, different life goals, different conceptions of what makes life worth living. Some people find meaning in solitude, others in community. Some value security, others adventure. Some prioritize pleasure, others duty. Harris seems to think that neuroscience can solve this problem by measuring brain states associated with well-being. But this approach faces the problem of neural diversity. Different people's brains respond differently to the same stimuli. What registers as pleasure in one person's brain might register as stress in another's. The measurement problem becomes even more acute when we consider interpersonal comparisons. How do we weigh one person's well-being against another's? If a policy makes the rich slightly happier but makes the poor much more miserable, is it morally justified? Harris's framework provides no guidance on these crucial questions. The problem extends to temporal comparisons as well. How do we weigh present well-being against future well-being? Should we discount future well-being the way economists discount future costs? Should we prioritize the well-being of existing people over potential future people? These aren't technical problems that will be solved by better measuring instruments. They're conceptual problems that require philosophical analysis. Harris's attempt to sidestep philosophy by appealing to science doesn't eliminate these problems, it just ignores them. Harris's approach has troubling implications for democratic self-governance that he never seriously addresses. If moral questions can be answered scientifically, then democratic deliberation about values becomes not just unnecessary but counterproductive. Why should we vote on moral issues when we can simply defer to scientific experts? This creates a fundamental tension between Harris's scientific approach and democratic values. Democracy assumes that ordinary people are capable of making reasonable judgments about moral and political questions. Harris's approach suggests that most people are systematically wrong about these questions because they lack scientific expertise. The implications are deeply authoritarian. If scientists can determine the correct moral policies, then popular resistance to those policies becomes a form of ignorance to be overcome rather than legitimate democratic disagreement. Harris seems comfortable with this implication, but he never seriously grapples with its consequences. Consider practical examples. If scientific research suggests that certain parenting practices promote child well-being, should those practices be legally mandated? If neuroscience reveals that certain types of education are more effective, should alternative approaches be banned? Harris's framework provides no principled way to limit the authority of scientific expertise. Harris's approach faces a serious challenge from evolutionary psychology. If our moral intuitions are products of evolution, why should we trust them to reveal objective moral truths? Evolution shapes our psychology to promote survival and reproduction, not to track moral reality. This creates what philosophers call the evolutionary debunking argument. If our moral beliefs are best explained by evolutionary pressures rather than exposure to moral facts, then we have reason to doubt their reliability. Harris acknowledges this challenge but never provides a satisfactory response. The problem is particularly acute for Harris because he wants to ground morality in facts about human psychology and well-being. But if human psychology is shaped by evolutionary forces rather than moral reality, then appeals to psychological facts become circular. Harris might respond that evolution has shaped us to care about well-being, and well-being is indeed what morality is about. But this response assumes that evolution has tracked moral truth, which is precisely what needs to be proven. The evolutionary debunking argument doesn't necessarily refute moral realism, but it does create a serious epistemological challenge. Harris needs to explain how we can distinguish between moral beliefs that are products of evolutionary bias and moral beliefs that track objective moral reality. He never provides such an explanation. Throughout the book, Harris oscillates between different interpretations of what he means by making morality scientific. Sometimes he seems to think that moral facts are just disguised empirical facts about human psychology. Other times he suggests that moral facts are irreducible features of reality that science can discover. This confusion undermines his entire project. If moral facts are just empirical facts about human psychology, then morality becomes descriptive rather than normative. We can determine what people do value, but not what they should value. The is-ought problem remains unsolved. If moral facts are irreducible features of reality, then Harris needs to explain what kind of facts they are and how science can access them. Are they natural facts like the facts of physics? Are they supernatural facts? Are they abstract facts like mathematical truths? Harris never clarifies his metaphysical commitments, but his scientific approach seems to require a naturalistic metaphysics where moral facts are natural facts. This creates the problem of moral naturalism. How can natural facts generate normative authority? The question, why should I care about well-being, cannot be answered by pointing to more facts about well-being. It requires a normative argument that goes beyond empirical description. Harris never provides such an argument. Perhaps the most damning criticism of Harris's approach is that it's practically irrelevant to the moral problems we actually face. Harris presents his theory as a solution to moral disagreement, but his vague appeals to well-being provide no guidance on specific moral dilemmas. Consider some concrete examples. Should we prioritize economic growth or environmental protection? Should we allow genetic engineering of human embryos? Should we permit assisted suicide? Should we redistribute wealth from rich to poor? How should we balance individual privacy against collective security? Harris's instruction to maximize well-being provides no guidance on any of these questions because they all involve trade-offs between different aspects of well-being for different groups of people. His theory doesn't tell us how to weigh competing values or resolve conflicts between individual and collective well-being. The practical irrelevance extends to policy questions as well. Harris suggests that science can determine the correct social policies, but he provides no concrete examples of how this would work. Which scientific methods would we use? How would we resolve disagreements among experts? How would we account for unintended consequences? These aren't minor implementation details, they're fundamental problems that reveal the inadequacy of Harris's approach. A genuinely scientific theory of morality would need to provide specific, testable predictions about which policies would promote well-being. Harris's theory provides nothing of the sort. Perhaps most troubling is Harris's dismissive attitude toward the philosophical tradition he's trying to revolutionize. He explicitly states that developments in moral philosophy are only of interest to academic philosophers, and that technical philosophical terms increase the amount of boredom in the universe. This anti-intellectual stance is particularly ironic coming from someone who claims to be advancing human knowledge. Harris wants to establish a new science while simultaneously dismissing the existing scholarship on his topic. It's like trying to develop a new theory of physics while refusing to engage with existing physics literature. The dismissal isn't just arrogant, it's self-defeating. The philosophical problems Harris encounters aren't new. They've been extensively analyzed by generations of careful thinkers. His failure to engage with this work means that he repeats mistakes that have been identified and analyzed for centuries. Harris's isolation from philosophical scholarship also explains many of his conceptual confusions. The problems he struggles with, the is-ought distinction, moral epistemology, the nature of well-being, have been extensively discussed in the philosophical literature. His ignorance of this work leads him to present elementary confusions as profound insights. The success of The Moral Landscape reveals something troubling about contemporary intellectual culture. Harris's book became a bestseller despite its philosophical inadequacies. This suggests that there's a market for intellectual products that promise simple solutions to complex problems. Harris's appeal lies partly in his scientific credentials and partly in his promise to make morality objective and rational. In an age of moral polarization and religious conflict, the promise of scientific morality is attractive. Harris offers to replace messy moral disagreement with clean scientific facts. But this promise is illusory. Harris hasn't solved the problem of moral disagreement, he's simply hidden it behind vague appeals to well-being. His scientific approach doesn't eliminate moral controversy, it just relocates it to questions about what constitutes well-being and how to measure it. The popularity of Harris's approach also reflects a broader cultural scientism, the belief that science can answer all important questions and that other forms of inquiry are obsolete. This view is not itself scientific but rather a philosophical position about the scope and limits of scientific knowledge. Scientism is particularly appealing in contexts where traditional sources of moral authority, religion, tradition, philosophical argument, have lost credibility. Science appears to offer objective, universal truths that transcend cultural and religious differences. But this appearance is misleading when applied to moral questions. Harris's confusion about the relationship between empirical and normative inquiry runs throughout the book. He seems to think that finding the neural correlates of moral judgment somehow validates those judgments, or that discovering what people value tells us what they should value. This confusion reflects a deeper misunderstanding about the nature of normative inquiry. Normative questions are not empirical questions in disguise. They're questions about what we have reason to do, what we owe to others, what kind of life is worth living. These questions cannot be answered by gathering more empirical data. Consider an analogy. We can study the psychology of mathematical reasoning, how people solve equations, what mistakes they make, which brain regions are involved. But this empirical study doesn't tell us whether their mathematical answers are correct. Mathematical truth is not determined by psychological facts about how people think about mathematics. Similarly, we can study the psychology of moral reasoning without this telling us whether moral judgments are correct. Moral truth, if it exists, is not determined by psychological facts about how people make moral judgments. Harris's confusion on this point leads him to treat empirical discoveries about moral psychology as if they were normative conclusions about what we should do. But empirical research can only tell us what is, not what ought to be. Harris's approach faces another serious challenge from evolutionary psychology. Our moral intuitions evolved in small-scale societies very different from modern complex societies. This creates an evolutionary mismatch problem that Harris never addresses. Many of our moral intuitions, about fairness, punishment, group loyalty, authority, evolve in contexts where people lived in small groups with face-to-face relationships. These intuitions may be poorly adapted to modern problems involving large-scale cooperation, global justice, environmental protection, and technological risks. If Harris wants to ground morality in facts about human psychology and well-being, he needs to explain how we can distinguish between moral intuitions that are adaptive in modern contexts and those that are evolutionary vestiges. His approach provides no guidance on this crucial question. The evolutionary mismatch problem is particularly acute for consequentialist approaches like Harris's. Our evolved psychology includes strong biases toward helping people who are similar to us, geographically close to us, and immediately present. But consequentialism requires us to weigh the well-being of all people equally, regardless of their relationship to us. This creates a tension between Harris's scientific approach and his moral conclusions. If science reveals that humans are naturally biased toward helping their own groups, should we embrace this bias or try to overcome it? Harris never addresses this question. Harris's approach faces new challenges from emerging technologies that could dramatically alter human well-being. Genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and pharmaceutical enhancement raise questions about the nature of well-being that Harris's framework cannot address. Consider genetic engineering. If we can enhance human cognitive abilities, should we? If we can eliminate genetic predispositions to depression, should we? If we can extend human lifespan indefinitely, should we? These questions cannot be answered by measuring current conceptions of well-being because they involve creating new forms of well-being that have never existed. Similarly, artificial intelligence raises questions about the moral status of non-human minds. If we create artificial intelligences that appear to suffer, do we have obligations toward them? How do we weigh their well-being against human well-being? Harris's framework provides no guidance on these questions. Virtual reality technology raises questions about the relationship between experienced well-being and objective reality. If people can experience perfect happiness in virtual worlds, is this genuine well-being or mere illusion? Harris's approach cannot distinguish between these possibilities. These technological challenges reveal the limitations of Harris's approach. His conception of well-being is anchored in current human psychology and biology, but technology is rapidly changing both. A genuinely scientific approach to morality would need to address these changes, but Harris's framework is ill-equipped to do so. The landscape of failure. The verdict on Harris's moral landscape is clear. It represents not a breakthrough in moral philosophy but a masterpiece of intellectual overreach. Harris set out to revolutionize our understanding of morality and instead created a work that demonstrates the dangers of approaching complex philosophical problems without adequate preparation. The book's failures are not merely technical, they're fundamental. Harris misunderstands the nature of moral reasoning, confuses empirical and normative inquiry, ignores centuries of relevant scholarship, and offers a theory so vague that it provides no guidance on actual moral problems. His approach doesn't solve the problems of moral philosophy, it simply ignores them. But the failure of the moral landscape serves a valuable purpose. It illustrates the indispensability of careful philosophical analysis. Harris's mistakes show us why the traditional problems of moral philosophy are genuinely difficult and why they cannot be solved by appeals to scientific authority alone. The book's popularity also reveals something important about contemporary intellectual culture. There is clearly a hunger for simple solutions to complex moral problems, and Harris's scientific approach appeals to this hunger. But intellectual honesty requires us to acknowledge that some problems are irreducibly complex and that scientific methods, however powerful, have limits. This doesn't mean that science is irrelevant to moral reasoning. Empirical research can inform our moral judgments by revealing the consequences of different policies, the psychological mechanisms underlying moral motivation, and the conditions that promote human flourishing. But this information must be combined with philosophical analysis to address the normative questions that science alone cannot answer. The ultimate irony of Harris's project is that in trying to eliminate philosophy from moral reasoning, he ended up doing philosophy very badly. His work is full of unexamined philosophical assumptions, conceptual confusions, and logical errors that could have been avoided through engagement with the philosophical tradition he dismisses. The moral landscape thus stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual hubris. It reminds us that expertise in one domain does not automatically transfer to others, that complex problems require careful analysis, and that dismissing existing scholarship is more likely to lead to error than to breakthrough. In the end, Harris's moral landscape is less a mountain range of objective moral truths than a conceptual desert, a place where rigorous thinking goes to die, replaced by the mirage of scientific certainty. The next time someone promises to solve ancient philosophical problems with modern scientific methods, we would do well to remember the lessons of this spectacular failure. The failure of the moral landscape doesn't prove that science and morality are unrelated or that moral knowledge is impossible. It simply shows that the relationship between them is more complex than Harris imagined and that moral reasoning requires both empirical knowledge and philosophical sophistication. The ancient problems of ethics remain as challenging and important as ever, awaiting thinkers who combine Harris's scientific enthusiasm with the intellectual humility and rigor that genuine philosophical inquiry requires.